Good evening, church. It's good to be with you. This evening, I'm just going to do a very brief overview of the prophets, because unless you understand who the prophets were and what they were doing, you might find yourself very confused. First of all, the prophet's job was to speak out God's warning and advice and judgments to his people. That's it. It's not always about telling the future, but it's about expressing God's will to the people. Each of these prophets spoke out in different times and in different circumstances. So to understand the books, you must understand who God was speaking to and why. The history books of the Old Testament give us these stories. To do that, we need the big events of Israel, the big history events of Israel firmly planted in our mind. I'm going to suggest there's 10 simple things to understand. Number one, God calls a man to start a nation. Genesis, the beginning of things. But famine comes and they find themselves going into Egypt to escape. While they're there, they become slaves and grow enormously. Until in the book of Exodus, we find that they leave Egypt, travel through the desert for 40 years, and eventually go back into the promised land. After Exodus, but before the Kings, the time called Judges, where we find the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, and the book of Ruth. After that, we find the time of Kings starts. But there's only 3 kings that rule over the whole of the land: Saul, David, and Solomon. And after that, there is civil war. And from then on, we need to understand the Bible talks about Israel as being the 10 tribes in the north. And it refers to Judah as the 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, in the south, where Jerusalem is. In the north, we find their story. It's called Israel, but it will end in disaster when they're carried away into captivity, and the land becomes what later is called Samaria. In the south, where we find Judah, that remains part of God's main story. So let's get our heads around this. Civil war splits the nation in half. If we go through the book of Kings and we read about the prophets, we will find that some of the prophets are based in those northern kingdoms, some in the south, and they will be speaking different messages to the different kings. Then we find the northern tribes conquered by the Assyrians, taken away as slaves. In the south, short time afterwards, about 100 years later, Judah is conquered by the Babylonians, King Nebuchadnezzar. Then eventually Babylon falls to the Medes and Persians, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, releases the Jews to go back to their promised land. These are the 10 phases, if you like, that we have to understand as the setting for the prophets. Now, something to remember. Not every prophet in the Old Testament writes a book. Moses writes the first 5 books of the Bible or assembles them from earlier records. But he doesn't have writings of his own prophecies, if you like, and yet he's the greatest of the prophets of the ancients. And then we find Elijah, and Elijah too, the second greatest prophet of Israel. And yet he doesn't have a book of his writings. So we must make the distinction. There's often prophets in the scriptures, but they don't necessarily have a book. So just keep that in mind. So let's go through the major prophets very quickly. In the north, we find the prophets of Elijah and Elisha, and Amos and Hosea, Jonah, Micah, and Nahum. In the south, around Jerusalem, there is the prophets of Shemaiah, Haggai, Obadiah, and Joel. In the north, when captivity happens, we find Nahum. And in the south, when that northern kingdom is being conquered and Jerusalem itself is under threat, we find the prophet of Isaiah and Micah. And then just before the time of the southern kingdom's fall, we find Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah. Jeremiah is critically important because he prophesies that they will only be captive for 70 years. Some of the prophets, and some people don't seem to realize this, actually live not in Israel, not in Judah, but actually live in captivity in Babylon. And here we find Ezekiel and, of course, Daniel. So later, when they are allowed to return home, or when the command goes out for them to go back and rebuild, we find the last three prophets of the Old Testament. We find Haggai and Zechariah, and lastly, Malachi. Well, that's a whirlwind tour. I hope you can try and take some of that in. It'd be good if we leave the chart really on the website, and then you can check it out again at your leisure. Okay, God bless you.